Number of passages that make peace a central piece or central ingredient. Often, some of those readings we might hear around Advent time because they have to do with the coming of an ideal king like David of old, i.e., those expectations were included in the idea of this coming ideal Davidic king or a Messiah, an anointed one. And as we look toward the future, those passages from Isaiah 60 and Isaiah 65 are filled with the basic idea is that the future God has in store for us is one of shalom, perfect peace. And when we get to the New Testament, it's similar. One of the things I don't talk about in great detail there are Jesus' teaching around. Now, in terms of the question of violence, just to remind you, I don't think there's any question about, if you just take Jesus at his word, that he was a proponent of nonviolence and he rejected violence himself. He also rejected and taught it uniformly for his followers. Some might disagree, and our ancestors historically, in our tradition especially, the Reformed or Calvinistic tradition, have adopted the idea created by Ambrose and Augustine in the 4th century, once Constantine came to power as the emperor and he became a Christian, and he started blessing the church with material blessing, land, property, wealth, and he also made it a matter of, if you wanted to get ahead, you needed to be a baptized Christian in the empire. And prior to that, it had been exactly the opposite. So as the sort of status of the church or being a follower of Jesus changed tremendously with Constantine, kind of a downside of that is that the church then became more worldly. Anyway, and Augustine and Ambrose worked very hard to create the ideal we know as the just war position, that if circumstances are in a certain way, present themselves in a certain way, then it is just or right for Christians to participate in armed conflict. That has been the view that most of our Presbyterian or Reformed forebears have adopted. You can't find it in Jesus, friends. It's not there. So Jesus, blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called children of God, one of the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and a few verses later, these words, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I know that sounds sort of barbaric to us, but again, as I mentioned before, in context, that was a good law because it prevented the escalation of violence. You know, your family insults another, and then there's and finally there's killing, and then mass killing, like gang warfare today. So that was, it meant you only can take retribution to the degree you've suffered loss, no more. That's the limit. That was a good law. I say to you, though, do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, like the occupying Romans might, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wishes to borrow from you. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Hey, a little quiz. Love your neighbor, is that a scriptural command?
Yes.
Absolutely. It comes from Leviticus. What about the command, hate your enemy? Is that a scriptural command? No. It is common wisdom in biblical period. That's why Jesus, it's not in any way scripturally appropriate or taught. I say to you, though, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, sends rain on the righteous and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even tax collectors do the same? In other words, he's arguing that love given reciprocally, I care about Jean cares about me, everything's happy. Well, everybody does that. But the argument here is that we're to love indiscriminately. If you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect. This means be absolutely, consistently loving or compassionate. Therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfectly compassionate. That's what it means. Don't be disturbed by perfect. It's not talking about perfection in terms of absoluteness in other areas. It's talking about being fully loving or compassionate. So big demands by Jesus. And here's Matthew's account of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. And once Judas comes, Jesus addresses him, friend, do what you are here to do. And then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place. All who take the sword will perish by the sword. And now he says something more significant. Don't you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? In other words, if I want to fight, believe me, I have resources. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way? At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were the word there is leistes, which should be translated revolutionary or zealot. And by the way, and that is the crime for which Jesus was crucified by Rome. And obviously it's a false charge completely, as he says here. And then he says, day after day I sat in the temple teaching, you did not arrest me. So, I mean, I've never been armed, I've never recruited an army, I've never participated in violence. But all this has taken place so the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Then his disciples deserted him and fled. So sometimes we think, oh, the disciples were pretty cowardly. Well, later they became cowardly. Here, at least one of them was quite willing to fight, but Jesus would not allow it. Jesus then teaches peace. Yes, Bob.
I was just curious, I mean, in this discussion, because there is a little passage that says, there's a passage, as I recall, that says something, that Jesus says you'll need swords or something.
Yeah.
And they say, well, we have 3 swords here among us, and he says, that's enough.
Okay.
Or that's, something like that.
Yep. That's Luke's gospel. Luke does say that just before they go into the garden. And they say, he's warning them, in other words, that a time of crisis is coming. And he says, you'll need swords. And they say, well, we have a couple here. He says, that's enough. It's not enough if he's going to arm his group. It's not enough. And later in Luke, only, as long as we're talking about Luke, he says something too, which shows that he rejects violence. And this is only in Luke, and this is when Jesus is carrying his cross toward the place of execution. And he says, these are really significant words, and we hardly ever talk about this. They led him away, and as they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him, probably because they beat Jesus within an inch of his life. And he couldn't carry it. By the way, he's not, those images that have him carrying the cross, he's not carrying the whole cross. He's carrying the patibulum, just a beam that his wrist probably will be nailed to. So, a great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never nursed. they will begin to say the mountains fall on us and the hills cover us. Now listen to this. For if they do this, if they're crucifying me when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Any of you ever bought firewood? I know this is politically incorrect now, but in the old days when it was fine to burn wood. Okay, is it practical to burn wood if it's just been cut? No. You have to season the wood, right? You got to let it sit for like a year or so. Okay, before it really burns well. So what does Jesus mean here? If they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? What does that mean? It means if they do this to me, and I embody nonviolence, and I teach it uniformly, what are they going to do when they find real revolutionaries? Well, friends, what they did is still visible to our eyes today. If you visit Jerusalem, what do you see? You see only the retaining wall that Herod the Great ordered. Everything on the top of the Temple Mount has been absolutely destroyed. And now there are 2 mosques, but the mosques are of medieval origin, and they sit up there where the Temple of Solomon once stood. So it's all gone. And Rome did put it down, with great enthusiasm. Titus was the Roman general who commanded the Roman force, and if you go to Rome today, when you're in the Roman Forum, there's a little entryway in, and you go through the Arc de Titu, the Arch of Titus. Romans love to celebrate every big military victory with some sort of public works display, often an arch, to celebrate this victory. Now, friends, Judea didn't put up a great battle. Jerusalem didn't put up a great battle. I'm sure they fought, and thousands upon thousands died and were slaughtered. But, Rome, there was no doubt Rome was going to win in the end. So it was pretty dramatic. And Judaism from that moment changed, friends. The temple has never been rebuilt. So Judaism changed from a temple-based religious system to suddenly a synagogue-based system. And what happened to the priesthood? Unless you know a Jewish friend with the name Cohen, which probably means they're hereditarily descended from the priestly line, it's completely inactive. So, wow. So Jesus is there warning that I've rejected violence. And if you're doing this to me, what's going to happen when you come across the real thing? Wow. Anyway. Okay, questions about this. Some people would say, Jesus, but the one time that he was violent was during the temple demonstration, the cleansing of the temple. And it does say in John's gospel alone, he made a whip of cords and he drove the money changers out, etc. He certainly stopped commerce for a short period of time, maybe 20 minutes, But it doesn't say he hit anybody with the whip. It doesn't say he beat anybody or struck anybody with his fist. He did create chaos, and he wanted to for a brief period. That's as violent as he ever got. And it doesn't say, again, he struck anybody. So anyway, I think that's the picture we get of Jesus. And here's just a principle. I was taught in seminary, and I think it was taught by every pastor I've ever had too, is that as Christians, and I think this is a comfort to us as we deal with today with the book of Joshua, although the Old Testament is very much part of our Bible, and it was Jesus' Bible, it's our Bible today. Jesus didn't reject it, and neither should we reject it. However, you can't take Old Testament teaching and immediately go to modern application. So Emily's talking about Bible study today in her sermon. You can't take an Old Testament teaching without running it through the sieve, you might say, or the filter of the life, death, and resurrection and the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. That's what makes us Christians. And so sometimes, And Old Testament teaching will be revised. Sometimes it will literally be rejected by Jesus. Like the use of violence, friends. That's just what we saw. He did it himself. He taught it. He died without resisting. He stopped his friends who wanted to resist. I think it's quite clear. So that's the teaching about peace. Questions about that? It's really important. It's really important. So everything I say about violence is a sliver. It's a problematic sliver, but it's a sliver in the entire biblical narrative. Jack?
Are you of the persuasion that there's two different schools of peace? One is political, social peace. The other is personal peace. Because I've been in churches, I'm sure you have too, that think that this must be spiritualized and has peace between man and God. Is what it all points to.
It certainly does point to that, but I think if we, in our, use a fancy word, hermeneutics, or in our interpretive process, if we try to take the Bible and say, this is only between Jesus and me, my own little personal relationship, and don't apply it to the world, then Jesus just spoke about our relationship with God. He talked a lot about that. But he talked a lot about social ethics. We have to try, and granted, it's not easy. Not easy at all to apply this stuff to political and social world in which we live. So I think that's a giant cop-out. Although at times I get it that it's very, very difficult. And good, we're saved by grace. Thank God, because otherwise none of us would qualify. Jesus never lowers the bar of what the Old Testament law demanded. He always raises it. Every darn time. Every time. He says, the law says don't commit adultery. I say don't even think about wanting to possess someone. Don't even think about it. You've already committed adultery in your heart. Barney and then Vic.
Well, I'm just thinking about someone, what the role of self-defense is, or defending my children, or the government comes, or somebody comes and says, I'm taking your property. It's sort of like, so if this is God's world and he wants to send the angels to do the bidding, is that what I should believe God for? Or I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to be a thorn in your side because I know, for example, Margie and I know each other pretty darn well, and I know you reverence Scripture. And I'm telling you, this is a place where we want, I think, to say, Jesus is nice, but you got to keep him in his place. We know, just common sense says you're going to defend yourself. My dad was a Marine in the Second World War. And I was raised in a household of guns, by the way. We had enough guns to stock a gun store. Just like we had enough booze in my house to, supply any bar. That's the household I grew up in. I'm just telling you, this is what the text says.
So that's fine.
So
if somebody comes and
yeah.
grabs my kid or
Yeah.
my grandchild
I think,
or something.
I think you have every reason to resist to a point, sure. I think one of the problems with guns, by the way, I'm a big hater of especially pistols, but firearms in general as a self-defense mechanism, because studies show it's something like 40 times more likely that a gun you store in your home will be used by someone in the family to commit suicide or to shoot some other family member. It's about 40 times more likely than it is to be used by yourself in self-defense against an intruder. That's just so, could you protect yourself? Sure, it's possible. But, this is a study commissioned long ago by Chief McNamara of the San Jose Police Department. And anyway, so you have to decide what you, and many people, I probably wouldn't be a conscientious objector. Because I think there are times when the evil is so great that, I think World War II is a pretty good example. But at the same time, we can think of lots of places where, think about war crimes, things that we did that weren't wonderful, and so many wars are justified by that just war theory. I think that, anyway, so I'm not a complete pacifist, but I'm telling you, I'm really challenged by Jesus' words here.
Yeah, so it's like, how do I, in view of these words,
Yeah,
and someone is injuring one
yeah,
of
yeah.
my grandchildren,
okay.
then
Okay,
do I just
sure,
say,
sure.
okay, fine?
Okay, but let me ask this too. In your lifetime, Margie, how many times have you had to intervene in that way when someone was using violence against a loved one? Have you ever had to do that? Now he's here.
Until we're done with this conversation.
But just think about it.
It could happen.
It could happen. Yes, it
And
could
so,
happen.
Thankfully, I haven't been at the park when somebody grabbed my kid.
Yeah. No, I get you.
So that's what I'm.
Yeah. Well, people have challenged Jesus with that too, believe me. And I'm not saying, I have difficulty applying it, but I'm just saying we're way too, Jack's comment about, well, what about personal versus social political? Aren't there two different realms? Shouldn't we separate? Like Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms. That's what Luther taught. I don't think it's a good idea. But anyway, I think if we're followers of Jesus, we need to try to figure out how to apply his words. And I don't think he meant some airy-fairy, otherworldly thing. I think he meant here and now. But is it easy? No, because I would be in the same position with Margie if somebody touched my little grandson, like we take him to the park in Oakland. Okay, yes?
Well, Paul makes it clear that government wields the sword for good reason, to maintain peace in the community and for defense of the nation.
Yeah, that's true.
And so Christians, because of that, are fully righteous in becoming policemen, becoming part of the military.
Okay, put it right at, okay. So Vic was just saying,
Right. And I've got another.
great, okay.
Everybody needs to aim this mic at their mouth.
Perfect.
They're going to swallow it.
Let me just make a comment to Vic. I think the vast majority of Christians agree with you. For the first 3 centuries, until Constantine, Christians, almost without exception, we can almost find 0 examples, participated in anything requiring violence, which means military or any kind of police force. 3 centuries. So those nearest to the time of Jesus took these words very seriously. One reason why they were hated, they weren't considered loyal members of the empire. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as the difficulty goes, I think it's historically very difficult because, like Bonhoeffer became a pacifist when he saw Altspite on the Western Front. He became a total pacifist. He was 100% pacifist.
Yeah.
Then he lives in Nazi Germany and sees what's going on there. And at some point, he just can no longer be 100% pacifist. He just can't do it. He just can't do it. And even though his heart was 100% behind it, and he was a person that thought through everything extremely well, he got to the point where he could no longer hold that position in the face of what was happening.
That's true. He participated in the bomb plot to assassinate the Fuhrer, he and a few others, and unfortunately the bomb plot, and this is a place where I'm endorsing violence, he wanted, and I think we all wanted that plot to be wildly successful. But I think a table leg and where the bomb was placed versus where the Fuhrer sat didn't work. He hardly got a scratch. So, and Bonhoeffer was arrested after that and then condemned to death and hanged at Flossenburg prison just a couple weeks before the Allies liberated the area. So, okay, now that I've upset you with these, let's move on to the even harder thing. This is going to be even harder. Okay, in your study guide, I talk about, Yahweh the warrior. And friends, every time you hear the phrase Yahweh of hosts, it means that God stands in front of a huge heavenly army of uncountable forces. You know, just like Jesus referenced, legions of angels. So God, sometimes that image of God as the great warrior is used, for example, it's used after the Exodus, the escape from state slavery in Egypt, where God fights for the people. And this is sort of an iconic sort of idea. This is God to Moses. You shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you're drawing near to do battle against your enemies. Do not lose heart or be afraid or panic or be in dread of them. For it is the Lord your God who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. When you draw near to, this is that I'm going to change for a minute. Anyway, so that sense that God was fighting with and for the people was a great comfort. And usually in ancient Israel, when the king or the person in charge really believed, really trusted God was with them, and they were doing the will of God, they had wonderful success, even when they were greatly outnumbered by their opponents. Now, this is the problematic part, and these are the words which guided Joshua and the Israelites as they enter the land of Canaan. This is kind of the rubric, or here's your overall strategy as you encounter these Canaanite city-states. So, when you draw near to a town, so friends, remember Moses dies on Mount Nebo, what we call Jordan today, in modern state Jordan. And from Mount Nebo, you can look down and see the whole Jordan Valley. And the Jordan River splits the valley, and of course at the bottom is the Dead Sea. Okay, so he's looking down there, and God says to Moses, now you can look at it, but you can't enter it. Moses dies on Mount Nebo, and then Joshua is commissioned to lead the people down, cross the river, and once they cross the river, they're technically now into the land of Canaan. And so all these city-states resident there, but they have to encounter. So here are the instructions. And you're going to notice 3 different approaches. When you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. So here's option 1. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then the people in it shall serve you in forced labor. Okay? Nobody gets killed, but they serve you in forced labor. Number 2, if it does not submit to you peacefully but makes war against you, you shall besiege it. And when your Lord God gives it into your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. That's number 2. You may, however, take your booty, as booty the women, the children, livestock, and everything else in the town, all its spoils. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall treat all the towns that are very far from you, which are not towns of the nations here. In other words, Canaanites. Now here's number 3. Here's the problem. As for the towns of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathes remain alive. They're all devoted, which means they're offered to God. You shall annihilate them. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Remember the Jebusites, because we're going to come back to them in a little while. Just as the Lord your God has commanded, so that you're to eliminate them and slaughter them all. This is all non-combatants. This is what we would call in modern terms, UN terms, a war crime. This is killing old people. This is killing children. This is killing all non-combatants. Why? So that they may not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do for their gods, and thus you sin against Yahweh, your God. So that's the problem, that ban. Okay, so the rest of the lesson is sort of mitigating factors. I wish there was some way, if this is a boil, so to speak, the third strategy, to just get rid of it, but it's there. I can't. And just like I might want Jesus to say, there are occasions where I wish he would add at least one PS. By the way, here are occasions when it's fine in my eyes to use violence. Yes, Jack.
As some of you may know, that I spent the bulk of my personal career in nuclear weapons development. And toward the end of that career, I became really anti-nuke. weapons. And one of the key reasons is because of collateral damage. Their impact is much, much greater than the target itself. And hence in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thousands were killed that were not combatants. And that will be true of any nuclear exchange. So right off the bat, nukes cannot escape this. They're part of annihilating the non-combatants.
So you understand the offense that this sort of thing has, at least in the modern world. It's one reason why the whole world is really, really, really angry with Russia right now, because in Ukraine they are shelling what they know to be civilian areas where there are no really military targets to be had. Why are you trying to make rubble all of the apartment buildings? Probably just to make the people suffer, put pressure on the government to go to the peace table and to settle, which means letting Russia keep what they have gained to date, probably. Anyway, so mitigating factors, friends, we don't have a lot of time, so let me go through these. One mitigating factor is Canaanite sin, that the Canaanites weren't just innocent people. And did anybody read the Genesis 15:16 passage? What do you think of the book of Genesis? What's God saying about the Canaanites?
And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Okay, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So God is going to give more rope, more time for the Amorites or any Canaanite peoples to repent.
It was 400 years while they're off in Egypt.
So 400 years is quite a bit of patience, I would say. So, and I gave you some passages to, give you some examples of their sinfulness, including, number 4 is really that even when Israel was just out in the Sinai wilderness, etc., and then going toward the promised land, they were attacked. So they were on the defensive by groups that tried to kill off the people that sort of lagged behind, etc. So there's that. Then there's a notorious sin that I think we would all find detestable as well, and that they practiced and that some Israelite kings copied. It says, they shall not teach you to do all the abhorrent things that they do. What was one of these abhorrent practices? Practiced in ancient Israel, Judy?
Sacrificing their sons and daughters.
Sacrificing their sons and daughters. Friends, when we typically translate the word Gehenna in the New Testament to be hell. Literally, Gehenna is a reference to the valley of the sons of Hinnom. If you go to Israel today, we all know, I think, the Kidron Valley. It's the little valley, little canyon, which lies between the temple walls facing east and the Mount of Olives right up here. There's a little valley. So Jesus goes, he commutes from Bethany, which is on the backside of the Mount of Olives during Holy Week. And then on Friday night, how far does he go? Where does he spend Friday night, the last night of his life? In the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the lower reaches of the Mount of Olives. So he leaves town, but he goes a short distance away, and that's where he is when he's arrested, etc. Okay, so that valley intersects the Hinnom Valley, which runs down the western edge of the city of Jerusalem. And in the Hinnom Valley is the place where they used to offer child sacrifice and do other sort of pagan rituals as well. And there were Hebrew kings, can you believe it, who adopted that practice, like King Manasseh, maybe the worst of all Hebrew kings, adopted that practice of child sacrifice. Like, oh my gosh. Think about the monster that makes God if you're requiring that sort of sacrifice. Yes?
There's an analogy in our own life, and time now is of offering sacrifice of unborn children for the god of convenience.
Okay, all right, yeah.
What about sending our sons off to fight wars?
Just
Okay, so mitigating factor one is that the Canaanites weren't just innocents. Mitigating factor two, driving out versus killing, by a margin of about 3-2 when you read the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, etc., those specific books, and you're looking for God's instruction about the way to treat the residents of these Canaanite city-states, you find driving out, like forced relocation, to be used more often than kill. Now, in the instructions we read from Deuteronomy 20, it wasn't drive out, it was kill. But if you read all of those documents, more often it's drive out than kill. So that should say something. The third mitigating factor is about the rhetoric of war. And so let's look at a couple passages, and maybe someone would read a couple passages. This is one. It's only 3 verses long. Anybody, is there a volunteer who'd like to read it?
Of course.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
We have a library.
Great.
So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland and the slopes, and all their kings. He left no one remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. And Joshua defeated them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, in all the country of Goshen, as far as Gibeon. Joshua took all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel.
Okay, there's that statement that they do well in battle because God is on their side and they're trying to be faithful. Okay, that's sort of a summary statement. Bob, if you could you do one more? That's one summary statement, and here's another. Just in the next chapter, but it's pretty similar. By the way, the Negev Desert is in the southern part of Israel. It borders the Sinai wilderness, what we call, or Egypt today, okay? So it's in the far south. We mentioned Gaza a minute ago. Gaza's going to be on what? It's going to be where? It's right on the west. It's in the Mediterranean coast, okay? And then other references, Mount Hermon is going to be right on the Lebanese border. It's going to be the far north. And we think of Israel as, kind of semi-flat. Some of it is, but the Negev is a desert. Mount Hermon has a ski resort on it. It's 9,000 feet. Many times when you go there, you're going to see it's snow-covered. So that's all in Israel. It's like California. It's like everything. California. Okay, so here we go with another summary statement, Bob.
So Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all the Negev, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and its lowland, from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, as far as Baal-Gad and the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He took all their kings, struck them down, and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites except the Hivites and the inhabitants of Gibeon. All were taken in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, so that they would come against Israel in battle, in order that they might be utterly destroyed, and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the Israelites. Soon, some remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war.
Okay, those are two summary statements. And what impression do they give you?
Total annihilation.
Total annihilation, total victory for whom? Joshua and the Israelite army. Total defeat for the residents of Canaan, right? So far? Okay, all right. All right. Any of you ever read the sports pages? Or just listen to sportscasts? You gotta hear it. So typically, friends, especially if you're, if you're listening to Giants broadcasts, for example, our announcers, and I love them all, are very pro-Giants. Yeah, I mean, let's face it, they're Giants right up in the paychecks. So in the sports pages, what sort of words do you see in like headlines about, like, let's say the Niners beating the Dallas Cowboys recently in the playoffs? Of course, we lost to the Philadelphia Eagles, who lost to the Kansas City Chiefs in last week's Super Bowl. But we had a pretty good season, didn't we? I mean, 49ers, they had like 10, 11 games they won in a row. So what sort of language do you sometimes hear, Jack? You crush, yeah, or destroy, or
Annihilate.
slaughter, or annihilate. Exactly. And what do you call that sort of language?
Pretty raw. Hyperbole.
Hyperbole, yeah. Exaggeration to make a point. They're just saying we had a great victory, but smash, kill, annihilate. Wait a minute, no one got a scratch during the, I mean, especially baseball. They didn't get scratched, or if they did, it was their own fault. So it's like these, we have this rhetoric of sports, right? Guess what, friends? They had a rhetoric in the ancient world, pretty universally, we think about the way they describe war. And if you're part of the winner, what sort of language do you think you used?
Yeah.
Grab some pine meat.
Yeah. That's one of Mike Kruko's famous statements. Mike Kruko is one of the Giants announcers, a former pitcher. And so, when somebody starts saying, grab some pine meat, go back to the bench in humility. Exactly. Okay, so friends, now I'm not saying that the Bible isn't true, but I'm saying what many scholars are saying, not just you, that you see a rhetoric around war that is hyperbolic. Okay, because of, let's look at some passages. Okay, here we go. By the way, when it talked about the hill country, okay, that includes what we know today as Jerusalem. It included Hebron, it included Shiloh, it included tons of places in the biblical narrative. When you go to Israel, there's the coastal plain, and then you go through the Shephelah, which are like rolling hills. And then in Jerusalem, I think you're around maybe 1,000 feet, maybe 2,000 feet in elevation. You're not that far, but that's the hill country. Their hills are not Sierra Nevada. I mean, they don't compare. Yeah, I mean, hill country, except for Mount Hermon, that compares. But nothing else does. So their hill country isn't real hilly, but it's not on the plain. It includes Jerusalem. Keep that in mind. Okay, now let's read a little bit further in Joshua. So now he's just said, basically, they had rest from war because they subdued everybody. We won. You know, like President George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier. Remember celebrating victory? Shock and awe. Okay, after that. So here we go. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, you are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed. What? Wait a minute. He just gave us a list like, what remains? This is the land that still remains. All the regions of the Philistines, all those of the Geshurites, from Syre, which is east of Egypt, northwards to the boundary of Ekron, is reckoned as Canaanite. There are 5 rulers of the Philistines, those of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, and those of the Avim in the south. in the land of the Canaanites and Mira that belongs to the Sidonians, that would be up in modern-day Lebanon, Tyre and Sidon, to Aphek, to the boundary of the Amorites, and the land of the Gebalites, and all Lebanon toward the east from Baal-Gad, below Mount Hermon, to Lebo Hamath, all the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon to Misrephoth, Maim, even all the Sidonians. I myself, now here's a promise though, I myself will drive them out, this is God speaking, from before the Israelites, only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. In other words, I'm going to do this in future. Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Okay. Let me show you another passage. Now we're a little further on in the Joshua narrative. I've allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations I've already cut off from Jordan to the Great Sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you, and shall drive them out of your sight. You shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. Now we go into the first chapter of the book of Judges. Friends, at least many scholars think that the books Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, all were written by either a school of people or an individual, and we call that person the Deuteronomic writer. So it's one history of ancient Israel, those books. So Judges is right next door to Joshua. Manasseh, this is now giving exceptions of stuff that's still left to do. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. But the Canaanites continued to live in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not, in fact, drive them out. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites who lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun, so these are various tribes, did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Naholol, but the Canaanites lived among them and became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Alab, or Akzib, or this is a speech teacher's dream, Helba, or Athik, or Rehob. But the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. So now, not only did they not drive them out, they also didn't obviously do what? They didn't slaughter them. They didn't kill them. So they're not killed and they're not driven out. Well, some. Forced labor. Yeah, forced labor is mentioned a number of times. Okay. Just one sec. Okay, this is just more about what they didn't complete. Yes, Vic.
Aren't all these facts that Israel did not annihilate these people and drive them out?
Yep.
Aren't they condemned for that? Aren't these kids, including Saul and Manasseh, aren't they all gravely punished for not doing what God told them?
Not all the kings.
Maybe
And
about Saul.
Joshua is praised. Joshua gets really almost nothing but praise. But Saul, there's one instance where he lets the Amalekites, he destroys the Amalekites. I mean, their army does, but he lets the Amalekite king live. And Samuel, the prophet, is so frustrated because that was a specific occasion where the ban, this whole thing about annihilate everything, was put into place. It's not a general policy, friends, that lasted for all of Hebrew history, but it was during the entrance into the land of Canaan. And it was, Vic, you're right, given Saul on that occasion with the Amalekites, and he didn't do it. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that Samuel tells Saul he's going to lose the kingship. In fact, he's already lost it. God's found a new king. And that takes a long time to put David in place, but anyway, yeah, you're right. Yeah. Now, but see, Joshua, we just heard, just did everything great and it was fine, and the people had rest from war. And yet, what do we find? Did they in fact kill everybody?
No.
No. Did they even drive everybody out? No. Now let's get a specific example. Here is the example of the Jebusites. And let me just describe all this, because this will take a little while. So, and I can give you a copy of this if any of you want. But in Joshua 3, verses 7 to 13, the Jebusites are among those Canaanites to be annihilated and driven out. Remember, in Deuteronomy 22, they were listed as one of those people groups to be annihilated. In Joshua 11, it says Joshua took all the land of the hill country. This should include Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the principal city of the hill country. And it's the Jebusite fortress city called Jebus. That was its original name. And you think, okay, unless that's hyperbole, then they should have taken it. They didn't, apparently. And Joshua 15 says, but the people of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this is the comment. So the Jebusites live with the people of Judah to this day. They weren't killed. They weren't driven out. They live with the people to this day. They're one of the peoples targeted for annihilation. Okay, now you get into the book of Judges. Jerusalem is conquered by the Israelites, we're told in chapter 1, verse 8. Verse 21, though, but the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So again, the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem among the Benjaminites to this day. And finally, in 2 Samuel, this is quite a bit ways later, David militarily took the stronghold of Zion, that is ancient Jerusalem, and renames it the city of David. But those writers that say that the Jebusites live with the Israelites to this day in Jerusalem. So in this case study, this is just a quote from Christopher Wright, who's the successor of John Stott, in terms of at least the mission work of the John Stott Foundation comments, and he's a PhD from Cambridge in England. It seems that the Jebusites were not actually destroyed, but were rather absorbed into the tribe of Judah. The Jebusites seem to have moved from the hit list to the home list over the course of Israel's early history. From being among the nations destined for destruction, they came to be included within the covenant people as a clan of Judah. So in other words, the Jebusites were absorbed, not destroyed. So it makes those summary statements that Bob read seem less than fully accurate. At least they didn't fulfill the explicit command of the ban. They didn't kill everybody. They didn't even drive everybody out. They did kill some people, and they did drive some people out. But it's a huge overstatement to say that, yeah, everything was pacified in Canaan. No, it wasn't. And here's a specific example, and the Jebusites seem to have just sort of merged with the tribe of Judah. Now, when you read the book of Joshua, there's more attention focused on Jericho than any other place by far. And it keeps being referred to again. There's this guy called Richard Hess who teaches at Western Baptist Seminary, which is a conservative Baptist. This is the Conservative Baptist Church of America. Certainly an evangelical, a good scholar, very conservative, very honoring of the biblical text. And he makes a case that what Jericho probably was in the 12th century, when presumably Joshua invaded, was a small military fort. When you go to Jericho today, you get to go up on this tell, this mound, in other words, which has remains of ancient Jericho underneath it in various levels. And of course, the lower you go, the older the city gets. As you go up and up and up, more junk accumulates and they build on top of other stuff. And okay, so it's difficult to determine what exactly existed in the 12th century BC, but Kathleen Kenyon, a British archaeologist in about the 40s and the 50s, did a long excavation and said basically in Joshua's time there was very little of that monumental tell that was occupied. Hess argues that it was just a small military outpost, so that when remember on the day that Jericho is destroyed, what does the Israelite army have to do? It's like they have to do a workout before they even engage in battle. What do? March around it. How many times? 7. Can you think of, I mean, if it's really a big place, like suppose you were part of an army and they said to you, you have to march around Santa Rosa once and then engage it in battle. I mean, wouldn't that tire the troops out?
Yeah.
You bet. They did it 7 times.
In one day.
In one day. It's not plenty of time, plenty of daylight to subdue it. What does that tell you? Hess says it was a very small, basically, almost no non-combatants there. That's what he said. He said, remember the prostitute Rahab that gives shelter to the Israelite spies earlier? She is saved. She's helped the people of God, and they rescue and protect her and her family. But it's a question then, in Hess's mind, are there in fact any other non-combatants even there? And he further argues that, of course, in ancient times, if you don't live right in the city center and you see an army coming, you have 2 choices. You can go to the fort if you have a fortified area close by, or you can just flee. So probably smart people just fled. So anyway, he's arguing, in fact, in the Hebrew, Jericho is described what was there, town or village or little fort, as an ear. That's the word used. And it means that it was a small place. It wasn't a giant city. Like one of the giant cities was Hatzor in Galilee, north of the Sea of Galilee. It was a huge, big, when you go to its archaeological routes today, they're vast, many acres, many acres. Like maybe downtown Santa Rosa. I mean, it's big. This is not, especially in the 12th century BC, we don't think it was big at all. And so Hess tries to say that sure there was slaughter done by the Israelite army under Joshua, but probably a number of these city-states or towns were literally military outposts, just kind of a fort with not many non-combatants present. And so that helps the sense that in terms of the amount of killing done, it obviously helps reduce it.
How about the trumpets?
The trumpets? What about the trumpet? Yeah.
Oh, the blow trumpets and the walls fell down.
Right.
How's that fit?
He makes no comment about the trumpets. But if God can help a smaller force win frequent battles against a larger force, I assume God can use trumpet blasts to destabilize walls. So there are summary statements for you in your study guide by both Christopher Wright and John Bright. I hope you read those. But it's not saying that there was no violence, but all of this together, I think, means that there's less violence than we might imagine. Okay, Chemi,
So I appreciate what you said about the wording being hyperbolic and all of that. But my question is, what about what it says about the commands of God? Is that hyperbolic too?
I'm not going to say that. I mean, one wonders for sure, but I think to me that's untouchable, and I just have to say I don't fully understand, especially if Jesus is the most complete revelation of God that we get, his life, death, and resurrection, and he teaches what you just saw. This is a pretty big change, pretty big amendment in future behavior for those who trust in God's most complete self-revelation. So it seems to be a pretty clear contradiction there. But I mean, on the other hand, people might argue, well, politically, in the Old Testament period, remember, God's dealing with a nation state, a people group, and I guess it's legitimate to wonder, can a people group which is fully tries to be nonviolent survive in a violent world? And I don't know. We have to answer. I mean, even today, like Switzerland has an interesting history and undergoes challenges how to be a neutral state in the world in which we live. So, Chimmy, that is the essence of the problem. God's own speech is referenced as commanding that, and what do we do with that? I don't have an answer.
I'm kind of wondering if there's some parallel or comparison between what's happening here, what God's telling to do here, and the flood, for instance. So, when God wipes out the whole earth, except for 7 people or something.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that was an entire, not just a civilization, but all civilizations.
Yeah.
And we basically have that in the Bible as something God did in order to quell the evil of the land that he could no longer tolerate. So now we have the same sort of language applied to the Canaanites,
Right.
And the same sort of fate, described.
Yeah.
We could spend another whole discussion on this alone.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just not the Old Testament involved here. It's our impression of what the New Testament also implies about God and violence in his handling of the lost. The whole traditional view of hell and the horror and violence that God uses in disciplining or punishing sinners, the vast majority of mankind, and a hell in which he burns them.
Well, there are a number of metaphors, as you know. One is that they shall be in the outer darkness where people weep and grind their teeth. So you've got unquenchable fire here, you've got outer darkness where people weep and grind teeth. So those are kind of mutually exclusive, mutually
I
opposed.
have the mic so I get the last word.
Okay.
So I think hell is the absence of God, the absence of his spirit. And what is left with the absence of God is the horrors that mankind brings upon itself.
Very speculative.
Well, it's from the Bible.
Okay.
How about annihilationism and universalism?
Okay. Vic is a proponent of annihilationism and universalism.
I'm not. I thought the Bible is.
It would be, the Bible gives some hints. There are some hopeful hints, but yeah. Well, anyway, I hope this helped to some degree. I apologize if it didn't. This is, I think, as tough as it gets in terms of taking the Old Testament and reading it as a follower of Jesus. And I sympathize with Margie, and we're not in really that different spot, but my job is to tell you what the text says and not to be apologetic for it. So I'm not apologetic for Jesus, but I'm telling you, it's really hard to apply. It's really hard to apply. Anyway, so our leader, Allie, is going to dismiss us with a prayer. So she needs the mic, Jack. And by the way, we do have a class next week. It's about gender, men and women in the Bible. I think you'll find it a little less controversial.
Still controversial enough. Would you join me in prayer? God, you created all of heaven and earth, and your ways are mysterious to us. Thank you that we have opportunities like this to worship you with our minds as we ask deep questions of the text, trying to get to the deepest meaning. May we never stop asking these questions. In fact, I think they honor you. You call us into relationship. You love us. You want to meet us right where we are. When we do struggle with some of these texts, remind us that before the punishment came, you showed extravagant love and patience. That doesn't take away all of the difficult images that we've read today or make it all right, but just help us hold that in mind and keep it close. God, on this day, I want to especially lift up our sister Cindy. I'm just so grateful for the gifts that she takes with her, for her love of you. And I ask that she is a blessing to others. And I ask you to protect and keep each person in this class and bring us back together next week, ready to ask more questions. And thank you for Kent, who's willing to take this on. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Thanks, Ken.
Your legs? Oh. You okay now? Okay, good. Yeah, yeah. I know the feeling.